At 6:23 in the morning, a frantic 911 call is made. John O'Keefe's frozen body is discovered in the snow. That is the timeline the prosecution wants you to believe. But the digital forensics tell a darker, more complicated story. According to data extracted from Celebrite, a Google search was made on Jennifer McCabe's phone hours before that discovery call. The time was 2:27 in the morning. The search terms were specific: how long to die in cold, and that search record was deleted. This forces us to ask the single most damaging question of this entire trial. If Jennifer McCabe was Googling how long it takes to die in the snow at 2 o'clock in the morning, while Karen Reed was sound asleep in her own bed, does that mean she knew John was already out there dying? This is not a theory, this is digital evidence from the court files. But to understand why this timestamp changes everything, we have to look at what John's own phone was doing at that exact moment. So, let's start with the story the Commonwealth wants you to buy. It is a simple story, really. They claim that on that freezing night in January, John O'Keefe never set foot inside the house at 34 Fairview Road. According to the people inside that house, the Alberts, the McCabes, the people who were supposedly his friends, John arrived, stayed outside, and was tragically struck by Karen Reed's SUV as she pulled away in a drunken rage. That is their version of the truth. They are sticking to it. They have testified to it under oath. But there is a problem with that story, a massive problem. See, witnesses can lie. Witnesses can get drunk. Witnesses can misremember things, or coordinate their stories to protect each other. People are flawed, but machines don't drink. They don't have friends to protect, and they don't lie. This brings us to the silent witness. In this case, John O'Keefe's iPhone. Throughout this trial, while everyone was arguing about who said what, the data extracted from John's phone was telling a completely different story, one that science backs up, but the prosecution cannot explain. We are talking about Apple Health data. You probably have it on your phone right now. It tracks your steps, your distance, and, crucially, your elevation changes. What I found was that the data from John's phone that night is not just a little bit off from the official story. It completely destroys it. According to the digital forensic analysis, between 12:21 a.m. and 12:24 a.m., John's phone wasn't sitting still. It wasn't just recording a guy standing on a front lawn waiting for a text message. The phone recorded approximately 80 steps. Now, 80 steps might not sound like a marathon, but think about it. If you are just standing on a driveway, or even walking from the street to the front door, that is maybe 10, 20 steps max. 80 steps is movement. That is walking through a house. That is pacing. That is activity. But the steps aren't even the smoking gun here. The real bombshell is the elevation data. Apple Health records something called flights climbed. It uses a barometer inside the phone to measure changes in air pressure, detecting when you go up or down the equivalent of a flight of stairs, which is roughly 10 feet of elevation. In that same narrow window, right after he arrived at the house, John's phone recorded him moving the equivalent of 3 flights of stairs. Let that sink in for a second. 3 flights. The prosecution tried to argue that maybe the terrain of the yard caused this, or maybe the phone was glitching. But we are talking about a flat, snowy front lawn. There are no hills on the front lawn of 34 Fairview Road that would register as 3 stories of elevation change. It is physically impossible to generate that data by standing outside. What struck me here was the layout of the house. The Albert home has a basement and upper floors. It's a raised ranch style. You have stairs going up to the main level, stairs going down to the finished basement, where, by the way, many people believe the actual altercation took place, and stairs going to the second floor. If John was just standing on the lawn before being hit by a car, how did his phone simulate climbing 3 flights of stairs? It doesn't make sense. Unless he went inside. If you look at the defense's theory, The data fits perfectly. John arrives. He walks up the front steps, that's elevation. He enters the house. Maybe he walks up to the main floor. Maybe he is led down to the basement. Up, down, moving around. The barometer tracks the pressure changes. The accelerometer tracks the 80 steps. The machine is recording a man moving through a multi-level structure. Meanwhile, the people inside the house, Brian Albert, Jennifer McCabe, and the rest, are all swearing on the stand that he never crossed the threshold. They insist he was a ghost that night, never seen, never heard inside those walls. So we have a complete deadlock. On one side, you have a group of people who are all closely connected, many of them law enforcement or related to law enforcement, all telling the exact same story that exonerates them from any involvement. On the other side, you have a cold, hard piece of technology that logged data points in real time, with no agenda and no bias. And this is important because this data was locked in the moment it happened. Nobody could go back and delete those steps. Nobody could edit the elevation change. It is a digital fingerprint of John's last movements. Which leads me to a question I want you to answer. I really want to know what you think about this, so please leave a comment below. Do you believe the testimony of a group of people partying late at night who have every reason to protect themselves, or do you trust the GPS and sensor data of a machine that doesn't know how to lie? Because if you trust the phone, then John O'Keefe was inside that house. And if he was inside that house, then Karen Reed could not have hit him with her car at the curb. It is logically impossible for both things to be true. So, the phone says he went in, but the prosecution says he was hit by a car outside. And that brings us to the tail light. So, the phone says he went in, but the prosecution says he was hit by a car outside. And that brings us to the tail light. If the Commonwealth's theory is true, that Karen Reed reversed her 3-ton Lexus SUV into John O'Keefe at 24 miles per hour, physics dictates there should be a massive crime scene. When a vehicle hits a human body with that kind of force and a tail light shatters, it doesn't just drop straight down. Physics is messy. Plastic explodes. It scatters. Debris flies everywhere. But on the morning of January 29th, when the first responders arrived and when the Canton Police Department secured the scene, do you know what they found? Nothing. The officers on the scene testified that they saw John's body. They saw the snow. They saw a cocktail glass. But they did not report seeing a field of red plastic shards. These are trained professionals whose job is to scan the ground for evidence. They were standing right there, looking at the area where John lay. And yet, the primary weapon of the crime, the shattered tail light, was virtually invisible to them. Now, let's look at the car itself. This is where the timeline gets incredibly suspicious. Before the car was taken into police custody, witnesses saw it. Specifically, Carrie Roberts, who was with Karen Reed that morning. She testified that she looked at the back of Karen's Lexus. What she described was a cracked tail light. Not shattered. Not missing. Just cracked, with maybe a small piece missing. This makes sense if, say, Karen had backed into John's car leaving the driveway earlier, which is what she told people she might have done. But then, the car was seized. It was taken to the Canton Police Department and driven into the Sally Port. That's the secure garage bay where police process vehicles. Once that SUV entered the custody of the Canton Police, specifically under the supervision of the investigative team, its condition changed drastically. By the time the prosecution presented photos of the vehicle later, that tail light wasn't just cracked. It was obliterated. It was shattered completely, with the casing missing and the bulb exposed. So, how does a tail light go from cracked in a driveway to destroyed in a police garage? This is where we hit one of the most disturbing glitches in this entire case. Naturally, a police station garage has security cameras. We should be able to watch the video of the car arriving and see exactly what the tail light looked like. Right? Well, we can't. When the defense requested the surveillance footage from the Sally Port for that specific time frame, they received a video that was broken. The footage jumps. There are minutes of crucial time missing right when the car is being brought in and inspected, and it gets weirder. The video that does exist is inverted. It is a mirror image. Why would official police surveillance footage be flipped? The result of this inversion is that it makes it incredibly difficult to tell which side of the car you are looking at. It obscures the truth. It creates confusion. And in that confusion, the condition of that tail light becomes a mystery. But the magic doesn't stop there. It actually travels back to the crime scene. Remember how the first officers found zero plastic at the scene? Well, days later, after the car had been sitting in the police garage, after it had been potentially tampered with, the Massachusetts State Police Special Emergency Response Team, or CERT, was sent back to 34 Fairview Road. And suddenly, it was raining red plastic. Days after the body was found, after snowplows had gone by, after people had walked all over the area, the CERT team claimed to find over 45 pieces of red tail light polycarbonate. But here is the catch: they weren't just finding big chunks. They were finding microscopic pieces. Tiny slivers of red plastic buried in the snow. The defense argues that this defies logic. If a tail light shatters on impact, you get big pieces and small pieces, sure. But to find 45 distinct pieces days later, perfectly preserved in a busy area, looks less like a car crash and more like someone took the broken pieces from the police garage and sprinkled them over the lawn like confetti. This leads to a terrifying possibility. The evidence wasn't discovered at the scene. It was brought to the scene. We have a cracked light that becomes a shattered light only after the police touch it. We have video evidence that mysteriously malfunctions and flips. And we have a miraculous discovery of evidence days after the fact by a team led by the very people Karen Reed's lawyers say are framing her. I need you to stop and think about this for a second, because this happens in movies, not usually in real life. I want to hear your take on this. Do you think finding microscopic debris days later at a disturbed crime scene is just incredibly thorough police work? Or is this a glaring sign of planting evidence to make the crime fit the theory? Because if that tail light was broken in the police garage, then the entire foundation of the prosecution's case against Karen Reed crumbles. The car didn't hit him. However, even if the car was damaged, does it explain the injuries on John's body? The answer might be no. If we strip away the personalities, the politics, and the drama, we are left with the most honest witness of all, John O'Keefe's body. The autopsy report and the crime scene photos tell a story that is vastly different from the one the prosecution presented to the jury. When John was found in the snow, his injuries were horrific, but they were also incredibly specific. He had severe trauma to the back of his head, causing a skull fracture. This led to what medical examiners call arcuitis. That dark, purple bruising around both eyes. This happens when the skull is fractured at the base, the blood pools forward. It's a textbook sign of blunt force trauma to the head. But here is what he didn't have. He didn't have broken legs. He didn't have a shattered pelvis. He didn't have internal bleeding in his torso. He didn't have the kind of massive, crushing injuries you would expect to see on a man who was just struck by a 3-ton luxury SUV traveling at 24 miles per hour. If a Lexus hits you at that speed, your body breaks. Physics is brutal. The bumper hits your legs, the grill hits your torso, you are thrown. Instead, John had something else. Something that has become the single most debated set of marks in this entire case. On his right arm, extending from his shoulder down to his forearm, were a series of deep, parallel scratches and puncture wounds. The Commonwealth tried to explain this away. They argued that these marks were caused by the shattered pieces of the plastic tail light scratching him as the car hit him. Or, they suggested it was road rash from hitting the pavement. But take a second to visualize road rash. We've all seen it. It's messy. It scrapes the skin off in a wide, abrasive patch. It looks like a burn. The marks on John's arm weren't abrasive patches. They were distinct, linear gashes. They were vertical. They looked less like he slid across asphalt and more like something sharp grabbed him and pulled down. This brings us to the elephant, or rather, the German shepherd, in the room. The Albert family, who owned the house at 34 Fairview, had a dog named Chloe. Chloe was a large German shepherd, a breed known for its loyalty, but also for its bite capability if agitated. The defense's theory is simple and disturbing. John went into the house. A fight broke out. The dog, sensing the chaos, attacked the intruder John. The marks on his arm align eerily well with the spacing of a large dog's teeth and claws. The head injury, that came from falling backward and hitting his head on a hard surface, like a basement floor or a piece of gym equipment, during the struggle. So, if the dog is the key, where is Chloe? This is where the behavior of the Albert family shifts from unfortunate bystanders to something much more suspicious. Immediately after John O'Keefe's death, almost right away, Chloe disappeared. First, the dog was rehomed to a different town. That already seems odd. Your friend dies on your lawn, and your first move is to send your dog away. But it gets worse. Shortly after being sent away, Chloe was put down and cremated. Gone. Destroyed. There was no chance to swab the dog's mouth for John's DNA. There was no chance to match the spacing of her teeth to the wounds on John's arm. The one living creature that could have connected the injuries to the inside of that house was eliminated. The thing is, if the dog had nothing to do with it, why the rush to erase her existence? But you don't have to just take the defense's word for it. The most damning blow to the prosecution's theory came from the federal government. The FBI and the Department of Justice, in their own independent probe, hired ARCA. These are the top-tier experts in accident reconstruction. They are the people who study how bodies move in crashes for a living. They have no dog in this fight. They aren't on Karen's payroll, and they aren't on the Canton police force. Their conclusion: it was a bombshell. The ARCA experts testified that John's injuries were inconsistent with a motor vehicle collision. They stated that if a car hit him at 24 miles per hour, his body would have been projected differently, and the damage to his lower body would have been significant. They looked at the car, they looked at the body, and they said, the math does not work. This was not a car crash. When the FBI's own hired guns tell you that the prosecution's theory is scientifically impossible, that is not just a reasonable doubt. That is a demolition of the case. I want you to pause and really look at the evidence here. Google the autopsy photos of John O'Keefe's arm, if you have the stomach for it, or look at the diagrams. Does that look like a scrape from a plastic tail light and asphalt to you? Or does it look like the claw marks of an animal attacking a perceived threat? So, the physics don't match. The injuries don't match. Which leads us to the only thing the prosecution has left: the confession. If you have followed true crime for any length of time, you know that a confession is the holy grail for prosecutors. You can have shaky DNA, you can have blurry video, but if the suspect stands up and says, "I did it," the case is usually closed. That is what the Commonwealth claims happened here. They built their entire narrative around 4 simple words that Karen Reed allegedly screamed in the snow that morning: "I hit him, I hit him." It sounds damning. It sounds like the guilt of a woman realizing what she has done. But when you actually peel back the layers of when and how this confession entered the record, the story doesn't just change, it completely transforms. Let's go back to that morning. January 29th. Karen Reed, Jennifer McCabe, and Carrie Roberts arrive at the scene. It is a blizzard. The wind is howling. Karen spots John's body in the snow. She is hysterical. She is panicked. By all accounts, she is in a state of absolute shock. In the initial interviews and the immediate aftermath, the story was that Karen was asking questions. She was trying to piece together a nightmare. She saw her cracked tail light. She saw John, and her mind jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Witnesses initially described her asking, "Did I hit him? Could I have hit him?" There is a massive difference, a legal canyon, really, between a frantic question asked in shock and a declarative admission of guilt. "Did I hit him?" is the sound of someone trying to understand a tragedy. "I hit him" is a confession. For months, the narrative was ambiguous, but as the investigation progressed, and perhaps as the physical evidence started to look less convincing, the witness accounts from Jennifer McCabe and Carrie Roberts began to sharpen. They began to evolve. Suddenly, it wasn't a question anymore. In later interviews and on the witness stand, Jennifer McCabe was adamant. She testified that Karen didn't just ask, she screamed, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him," repeatedly. She painted a picture of a woman who knew exactly what she had done. But here is where the paper trail, or rather, the lack of one, betrays that story. Police officers are trained to document everything, especially the words of a suspect. Officer Seraph was the first officer on the scene. He was standing right there amidst the chaos. If a woman is screaming, "I confessed to murder," 5 feet away from a police officer, that is not a detail you save for later. That is the headline of your report. That is the first thing you radio in. Yet, in Officer Seraph's initial police report, nothing. There is no mention of Karen Reed screaming, "I hit him." There is no mention of a confession. The report describes a distraught woman, a frozen body, and the weather conditions. But the smoking gun confession is completely absent. It's not just him. The firefighters and paramedics who were working on John, they testified that they heard Karen screaming, but they described her as grief-stricken and confused. They didn't report a clear admission of guilt either. At this point, I started questioning the memory of the witnesses. If someone screams a confession at a murder scene, that is line 1 of your police report. How do you forget to write that down? It defies standard police procedure. It defies common sense. You don't forget a confession and then remember it months later when the district attorney needs to strengthen the case. The fact that this statement only solidified after the theory of the crime was established suggests that the memory was reconstructed to fit the narrative, rather than the narrative being built on the memory. And we have to look at the pressure these witnesses were under. Jennifer McCabe is at the center of this web. She is the one who made the Google search. She is the one whose timeline is under fire. By shifting the focus to Karen's confession, she effectively deflects the scrutiny from her own actions and the actions of those inside the house. If Karen confessed on day 1, why did the police let her leave? Why wasn't she arrested on the spot? They let her go to the hospital. They let her go to her parents' house. They didn't treat her like a confessed killer until much later. Actions speak louder than words, and the actions of the police that morning tell us they didn't hear a confession either. The evolution of this testimony from a question to a statement is what legal experts call witness malleability. But in the context of this case, with the Alberts and McCabes circling the wagons, it feels less like a trick of memory and more like a coordinated effort to nail down a scapegoat. So, we have a confession that appears to be retroactive. We have physical evidence that appears to be planted. We have digital evidence that appears to be deleted. Any one of these things would be bad. But when you put them all together, you don't just have a messy investigation. You have a directed one. And usually, investigations are directed from the top. But maybe the reason it wasn't written down is because the investigation was never about finding the truth. It was about who was investigating. In every murder case, there is one person whose job is to be the ultimate filter for the truth. This is the lead investigator. They are the ones who decide which leads to chase and which ones to ignore. They decide who is a suspect and who is a witness. They control the crime scene. In the case of John O'Keefe, that man was Massachusetts State Trooper Michael Proctor. On paper, Trooper Proctor was supposed to be the neutral party. The state police were brought in specifically because the Canton police had a conflict of interest with the Albert family. Proctor was supposed to be the fresh set of eyes, the unbiased professional who would go wherever the evidence led him. But that is not what happened. Instead of an impartial investigation, what we got was a masterclass in corruption and character assassination. It turns out, Michael Proctor wasn't a stranger to the Albert family. He was friendly with them. He had connections to them. And from the very first moments of this case, before the snow had even melted, he had already decided who the villain was. And it wasn't anyone inside that house. The most shocking revelation of the entire trial didn't come from a forensic lab. It came from Michael Proctor's own cell phone. During the trial, the defense forced Proctor to read his own text messages aloud to the jury. These weren't official police communications. These were texts sent to his high school buddies, his sister, and his colleagues on the force. And the content of these messages is honestly hard to stomach. While he was supposedly investigating the death of a fellow officer, Proctor was texting his friends, calling Karen Reed a whack job. He wasn't discussing the geometry of the crash or the timeline of events. He was mocking her mental state. He was dehumanizing her. But it got much darker than just name-calling. Proctor made vile, personal jokes about Karen's medical condition. Karen suffers from Crohn's disease, a serious autoimmune disorder. In his texts, Proctor made fun of her health issues, making grotesque comments about her bodily functions. It was juvenile, it was cruel, and it showed a complete lack of respect for the human being he was investigating. Then, there was the line that made the entire courtroom gasp. Proctor had seized Karen's phone. As the lead investigator, he had access to her entire digital life, her emails, her banking, her photos. And what did he do with that power? He texted his superiors and friends admitting that he was searching through her phone looking for nude photos. He wasn't looking for evidence of a crime. He was looking for leverage, or entertainment, or just a way to violate her privacy even further. Think about the implications of that. The man responsible for collecting the physical evidence, the man who claimed to find the tail light pieces, the man who interviewed the witnesses, was simultaneously sexually objectifying the suspect and mocking her to anyone who would listen. When he took the stand, Proctor had to face these texts. He couldn't deny them. They were right there in black and white. He admitted to sending them. He admitted they were unprofessional and regrettable. He admitted that, yes, he disliked Karen Reed personally. But then, he looked the jury in the eye and said something that defies all logic. He claimed that despite hating her, despite calling her names, despite looking for nudes, and despite being buddies with the Alberts, his investigation was totally objective. He claimed that his personal bias had zero impact on his professional conduct. He wants us to believe that he could switch off that kind of vitriol like a light switch the moment he stepped onto the crime scene. This is where the case against Karen Reed stops being just about a car accident and starts being about the integrity of the justice system itself. Because if the foundation of the investigation is rotten, how can the house stand? If the man collecting the evidence is biased, then the evidence itself is tainted. We call this the fruit of the poisonous tree. You cannot get a clean conviction from a dirty investigation. The prosecution tried to downplay this. They said Proctor's texts were just locker room talk. Just a guy blowing off steam. They argued that being a jerk doesn't make you a frame artist. But we aren't talking about a guy being rude to a waiter. We are talking about a state trooper holding a woman's life in his hands. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest in the comments, because this is the crux of the whole trial. If you were on that jury, and you found out the lead detective was sending texts like that about the suspect, Would you trust a single piece of evidence he touched? Would you believe him when he says he found tail light pieces in the snow, or would you wonder if he put them there himself? Because for many people watching this trial, Michael Proctor didn't just ruin his own career with those texts. He destroyed the Commonwealth's case. He proved that from day one, Karen Read never stood a chance. And that is why we are here today. Not because the evidence is clear, but because it is clearly broken. When you step back and look at the Karen Read trial as a whole, you aren't looking at a simple case of vehicular homicide. You are looking at a house of cards built on a foundation of "it just so happened." We are asked to believe that it just so happened that John O'Keefe's phone glitched and recorded him climbing 3 flights of stairs when he never entered the house. We are asked to believe that it just so happened that Jennifer McCabe's Google search for "how long to die in cold" at 2:27 in the morning was a digital error or a phantom record, and not a sign of guilty knowledge. We are asked to believe that it just so happened that the tail light on Karen's car transformed from cracked to shattered while in police custody, and that the security camera in the police garage just so happened to miss the most critical minutes of that inspection. We are asked to believe that the Albert family dog, Chloe, just so happened to vanish and be cremated right after a man was found on their lawn with scratch marks on his arm that looked exactly like dog bites. And finally, we are asked to believe that the lead investigator, Trooper Proctor, who hated the suspect, mocked her medical condition, and had close personal ties to the witnesses, just so happened to conduct a perfectly neutral and honest investigation. Any one of these things might be a coincidence. But all of them, together, that is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. The tragedy of the Karen Read case is not just the death of a good man, though that is the heartbreaking center of it all. The tragedy is the complete collapse of trust in the system that was supposed to solve his murder. This case serves as a terrifying masterclass in what psychologists and legal experts call confirmation bias. From the moment the sun rose on January 29th, the decision had been made. The narrative was set. The girlfriend did it. She was drunk, she was angry, she hit him. Once that decision was made by law enforcement, the investigation stopped being a search for the truth and started being a manufacturing process. Every piece of evidence that didn't fit was ignored, like John's injuries. Every piece of evidence they needed was found, like the magic tail light pieces. And anything that contradicted the story, like the Google search, was explained away as a glitch. The reason this matters, the reason why thousands of people are protesting outside the courthouse holding "Free Karen Read" signs, is because if this can happen to her, it can happen to anyone. Karen Read had the financial resources to hire a dream team of defense lawyers who could hire FBI experts and digital forensics wizards. Most people do not have that luxury. If the police decide you are guilty, and they are willing to bend the rules to prove it, the truth is the first casualty. The jury in this case ultimately could not reach a verdict. They were deadlocked. And really, can you blame them? How can you convict someone beyond a reasonable doubt when the investigation itself is the source of the doubt? We are left with two competing realities, and they cannot both exist. In one reality, Karen Read is a cold-blooded killer who left the man she loved to freeze to death in a snowbank, then put on an Oscar-worthy performance of grief the next morning. In the other reality, Karen Read is the victim of one of the most elaborate, clumsy, and corrupt frame-ups in modern American history, a scapegoat chosen to protect a powerful family and a house full of law enforcement officers who know exactly what happened in that basement. So, I turn this over to you. You have seen the timeline. You have heard about the steps, the search, the dog, and the texts. After looking at all the digital and physical data, do you believe Karen Read is a murderer, or do you believe she is an innocent woman trapped in a cover-up? I want you to really think about the precedent this sets. If we accept an investigation this flawed, what does justice even mean anymore? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. I read every single one of them. As for me, after spending weeks digging through these files, reading the transcripts, and watching the testimony, I am left with a heavy feeling that has nothing to do with the snow. This case started with a tragedy in the snow. But what I found was that the cold didn't just come from the blizzard. It came from the silence of everyone inside that house. And until someone speaks, John O'Keefe is still waiting for justice. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. If you value this kind of detailed analysis, please hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. I'll keep following this case as it develops. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.